Hey, in this video, I want to show you an alternative way of processing reverb sends. When you're using reverb as an additive effect, which is pretty common, you put it on an auxiliary and so multiple tracks can go to the reverb and the effect of it is being added in parallel to the dry signals that you're putting it on. When you use it as an additive effect, some reverbs, if you do not process the signal that's hitting the reverb, in fact, most reverbs now, it's going to come back at you as a wash of the frequencies that you send to it. I know that sounds sort of obvious because reverb is kind of a wash of sound and it's going to sound like what you give it frequency-wise. The problem with that is it can add a lot of mush to your mix, and it can, to me, I see things visually. I have a mental image of sounds when I hear things. I don't have a photographic memory or anything, but I do see sound sometimes. It's kind of hard to explain. But a lot of reverbs, because they are full bandwidth and they're lush and they're dense and they're, high quality sound, trying to make these perfect acoustic spaces, when you give them a signal, it's almost like I see in my mind this mental sort of almost a cable. There's the signal, like say a snare drum, and you send to it. It's like the snare drum kind of almost connects to this reverb that becomes this sort of blooming mushroom kind of, here's this ambience, this reverb. And it's like they're connected. And sometimes I don't want that. Sometimes I want to hear the signal that I'm reverberating, but I want it close and I want it near me, and I want the reverb separate and farther away, more in the background. And sometimes that's hard to get with just like processing the input of a reverb, as is typically done with an EQ. If you put an EQ in front of your reverb, when you open up your auxiliary track, you put the reverb on it, and you put an EQ in front of it, then you can tailor the frequency response of the EQ of the reverb so that maybe pull out low mids so it doesn't get the bottom of the mix all muddy and stuff. But that doesn't really necessarily, it changes the frequency response, but it doesn't really change the character or the timbre of the sound that's going to the reverb. They still really relate a lot to each other. And sometimes I want to create additional separation between the sound that I want to put space around and the space itself. So I don't want them to sort of have that visual connection that I see in my mind when I hear it. For the sake of demonstration, I'm going to show you a track here. Kind of just putting together this rhythm track, and I have put reverb on the drums. The drums were recorded in a large room. These are from the same sessions that I did on the video last week, but I'm not using the room mics in this session for demonstration purposes to show you this idea. But you could tell, like from the overhead mic. Let me turn the reverb off. That's just the overhead. I mean, there's some EQ on it, but you can hear the room. So that's an ambient room, but I'm not using any of the room mics. I'm going to create an ambience that complements that. So here's the track as is, with no artificial ambience added to the drums and no room mics. So the snare's hitting you right up front. It's all clear. It feels dry. It's kind of a melon camp kind of vibe, kind of a raw, just rock thing. But I want to add some ambience to that. So what I've done is, let me just play this for you. Here's what I have done to create what I believe is complementary ambience to this. It's not over the top, but it's ambient. And I guess it's kind of subtle, but when I take it away, I'm going to take it away. And I'll add it back in. So you can tell that it's there, but the distinctness of, in fact, let me just go a little further with the reverb. Let me just be more obvious with it. So when I take it away, you really know. So that to me is too much reverb, although some people may really like that. But the distinctness and the articulation of the drums themselves doesn't change. It just has more ambience kind of enveloping it. That is different than, say, this. Which sounds good. But that to me, well, let me mute it. Put it back in. That to me sounds like a reverb unit. It has kind of the same frequencies as the snare. Versus, once again, this. So let me go ahead and mute the other elements and just show you the drums. Okay. All right. So what have I done here? Basically, I'm doing something I typically don't do actually very often, and that is using a reverb send on the snare drum. I typically don't. I use room mics, and then I'll maybe, add reverb to the room mics, or I might add reverb to the drum submix or something that's a little bit more of a global perspective. It's usually not the snare drum or the toms or something, because that's kind of usually winds up kind of almost giving it an 80s vibe to me. The sound of the close mic'd instrument with those frequencies that you hear right next to the drum going to the reverb and being reverberated, as opposed to what a room really hears, which is a completely different sound and timbre with when there's distance between the walls of the environment and the drum itself. I mean, it's so far removed from it, it sounds completely different by the time the sound gets there and then comes back at you. It's a totally different sound, and that's why I prefer room mics, because it's just more authentic sounding, and reverbs tend to sound like reverbs to me. They're too polite and they're too nice. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just got my reverb. This is a Proto-Verb. Look it up, by the way. It's free. It's a super simple plugin. It's what I happen to be using on this because I do like the sound of it. And in front of that, I've got an EQ, which is pretty typical to filter and to EQ the signal that's hitting the reverb. So without this EQ, it sounds very 80s like this. Right? Very 80s. With the EQ, still pretty 80s, but it's different. And it's good sound. But it sounds like reverb to me. It sounds like a reverb unit to me. So the other thing that I've done here, I'm going to bypass that and I'm going to open this. This little plug-in, Sans Amp, I think it's just free with Pro Tools now. It's part of the Bomb Factory thing, a lifetime ago. This is horrendous on guitars, in my opinion, but it sounds awesome on drums and all sorts of other things. Really a useful plugin for a lot of things. Very creative, lousy guitar amp simulator. But by running that in front of the reverb, I'm really dramatically changing the character of the sound, not just the frequencies, but the actual character of the sound, the timbre of the sound that's hitting the reverb. So what's coming from the reverb is fundamentally detached sonically from the sounds that are going to the reverb. So it creates that additional layer of separation audibly between your close sounds and the reverberant sounds. So sometimes that sort of connection that I see visually, sometimes you want that, but a lot of times you don't. I want the dry sound up front, but then I still want there to be an ambience on top of it. So I'm still got the reverb up loud here so you can really hear it. But this is what that sounds like. Now you're like, Joel, that sounds like an 80s reverb. Well, kind of does. Early 80s reverbs that really were kind of crappy. I like crappy reverbs. I gotta say, I like crappy reverbs because most environments that you're in are crappy environments. They aren't meant to be lush sonic environments. They're just rooms, parallel walls and plaster and, wood and carpet and just whatever. There's a charm to that. The reason there are rooms in the world where people like to record things is not necessarily because that room sounds amazing in a proper way. It's because it has a vibe about it. Its anomalies and its weirdnesses and its faults are charming, and people like it and they want to work in that environment. And that's sort of the way crappy reverbs are, particularly if you're dealing with a dense mix. If you've got a really dense mix, there's not a lot of space in the spectrum for sound to fill in. So if you get a really nice, lush, full frequency reverb, that's this gorgeous thing, and you put it like on drums or a vocal or whatever, and the mix going on around it is dense, you're going to have to use so much of it to make it audible that it's going to be, and you probably may have had this experience where it's like you're turning up the reverb and it's too loud, but then you turn it down some and now you can't hear it. But when you can't hear it, it's too much. You can't find that right spot. It's because the character of the reverb is wrong, and you need to remove the things that are stepping on other elements of the mix and making your mix muddy, and also making it hard to hear the reverb because it's impacting all, or it's reacting with all of these other elements. But if you carve away and leave the spaces of the things that aren't really occupied, the frequencies that aren't really occupied by other elements in the mix, then it can be perceived without it having to really be loud because it's filling in spots where there's really nothing else there. And so it makes your mix bigger. And it makes everything clearer too. But as a result, like if you have a killer bass sound and you've got great drum sounds and good guitar sounds and all that kind of stuff, then what you're left with reverb-wise is going to probably be crappy sounding. And let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take this out of the drum submix and I'm just going to assign the reverb directly to the output and mute the drum submix so you can still hear the reverb by itself. Listen to this. That is not a pleasant sound necessarily. Now, real quickly, let me just go ahead and show you the EQ'd version rather than the SansAmp version. That's more refined, albeit obviously I've got some lows scooped out of it. So again, the SansAmp adds that crunch and it makes it very mid-rangey, which is not a pleasant sound by itself. But when you put it in the mix, and then you don't have it as loud as I've got it here, but more realistic to like what it would actually probably be. Let me bypass it. See, the sound of the close drums doesn't really change. It's just, there's nothing going on behind it now. And then when I put it back in, there's something else there. I'll push it up again so you can hear it a little better. Now if you push it up a lot, it's going to sound like a reverb, yes. But if you blend it in naturally, and then again, let me compare the two. This is the SansAmp version. Here's just the EQ version, which still sounds really good. But it has more frequencies in common with the drums, which makes it sound more like a reverb to me. Because those are close frequencies, those are not distant frequencies. Whereas going with the SansAmp, the sound's very different. So it's ambient, but it doesn't connect to the dry drums. Feel free to listen to this again. This is kind of, I sometimes hesitate to make videos like this because I realize this can sometimes be hard to hear. To me, the cumulative effect of subtle treatments like this has a big impact on your mix. And so sometimes bold strokes and doing things obviously and in your face is really, really cool. And sometimes lots of little subtle things here and there really add the spice to the mix that just makes it exciting to listen to. So this isn't one way is right and one way is wrong. This is simply another tool in the tool kit for those moments when you want to add ambience to something, but you do want to retain the character and the intimacy of the dry signal as well, and really relegate the ambience to the background. So I hope, as usual, that this is something that's useful, that you'll be able to use. Please, if you like this, share it with people. I am trying to grow my channel. If you're into drums and recording drums and mixing in general, and you think this is kind of cool, please subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be notified each week when I put a new video up. And I just appreciate you watching the video, and I hope you got something out of it. Thanks. I hope to see you again.